He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lift his hand. But when Donald Trump stepped past the velvet rope and reached toward the crown of St. Edward, the royal guard moved. One step, one grip. A gloved hand on a former president's wrist. The room froze. Flashbulbs caught it. The prince watched it happen. No one spoke, because no one knew what came next. When protocol was shattered by silence, and a centuries-old rule was enforced, not by law, but by one man who refused to blink. What happened after that step cost him everything, or did it? Now, before we begin, make sure to subscribe and let's get into it. It was one of those days where the air inside Westminster seemed to hum with something older than time. A private viewing of the crown jewels wasn't entirely unprecedented, but it was rare enough to require layers of approval, archival oversight, and a level of security usually reserved for funerals. Not a tourist exhibit, not a press tour, just one select set of foreign guests and the weight of 1,000 years watching in silence. Lance Sergeant Arthur Whitlock stood at his post outside the Crown Room's inner arch, posture immaculate. At 38, he'd spent nearly 2 decades in Her Majesty's service, now His Majesty's, and earned a reputation for quiet, unshakable discipline. Not charming, not chatty, but precise. In a world where tourists blurred photos and dignitaries blurred lines, Whitlock was the kind of man who never moved half a second too soon or too late. Today, that mattered more than ever. The crown of St. Edward, the centrepiece of coronation, consecrated in 1661 and used in every crowning since, was to be displayed on its velvet pedestal without its usual glass casing for a limited restoration inspection. Conservators had deemed it safe. Palace protocol had greenlit a short private showcase, and at the top of that short list, the former President of the United States. Not just a visit, a gesture, a symbolic moment of Anglo-American continuity. Whitlock had read the internal memo twice. The briefing stated, "Maintain ceremonial stillness unless direct physical compromise occurs." In other words, no matter what Trump said or did, the guard was to remain a figure of stone, unless the crown itself was at risk. And that possibility, however unlikely, was why Whitlock had been chosen. Behind him, the crown chamber gleamed under soft natural light, filtered through centuries-old stone slits. A thin red rope separated the pedestal from the guests' viewing arc. To most, it would be an invisible line. To Whitlock, it was sacred. "Guest arrival in 6 minutes," came the quiet note through his comm bead. He gave no reply. Just a small flick of his eye, verifying the conservators, the curators, and the 2 yeoman warders flanking the eastern door. The silence was immaculate, as if even the walls knew something holy was in the room. Then came the echo of approaching shoes, not polished black Oxfords, but scuffed rubber soles. The kind that made decisions without asking, that expected the world to flex for them. Donald Trump had arrived. The doors to the Queen's Gallery swung open a few seconds too early. Protocol said guests should be announced at the inner checkpoint, vetted by both palace security and liaison staff, before stepping foot inside the jewel wing. But instead, Trump strolled in ahead of schedule, flanked by 2 personal aides and a private bodyguard whose earpiece didn't match palace comm specs. Trump didn't slow to observe the stained glass or pause beneath the high coffered ceilings. He moved like someone entering a golf course conference room, not a vault containing the crown of 1,000-year monarchy. "Nice place," he muttered, loud enough for the senior conservator to hear. "Little cold, but not bad. This the one with the jewels?" Behind him, an aide with an iPad nodded eagerly. "Yes, Mr. President, this is the scheduled showcase." But Trump waved a hand. "I know what it is. I've seen pictures. The real thing better, sparkle. People expect sparkle." Whitlock, already standing at the base of the stone column leading into the crown room, gave no response. His eyes remained forward, chin levelled, the ceremonial rifle motionless at his side. He didn't blink when Trump's team moved too close. He didn't shift when the bodyguard, an American ex-military type with a buzz cut and tactical loafers, gave him a once-over as if evaluating a threat. Trump's gaze swept across the chamber. Where is it? The lead conservator, Dr. Helen Reeves, a woman who'd worked with royal regalia for over 2 decades, gestured toward the low marble dais. The crown sat in perfect stillness, temporarily uncased for inspection. Gold arches rising from a base encrusted with 444 gemstones. Velvet cap dyed deep purple beneath the polished cross at its summit. No protective dome of glass, just reverent distance and the warning presence of trained silence. Trump stepped forward. "Wow," he said flatly. "So this is it, the real deal." He leaned in slightly. "Lots smaller than I thought. You'd think a king's crown would be, bigger." A second aide chuckled nervously. The conservators did not. Trump looked over his shoulder. "Get a picture, nice and close, no glare." One of his men raised a phone, no flash, but still too close to protocol comfort. Dr. Reeves cleared her throat. "Mr. President, we kindly request all photographs remain outside the 5-foot perimeter for the Crown's protection." Trump smiled without humour. "Relax. I'm not going to wear it." Then, turning to Whitlock, he nodded. "Hey, you, guard guy, what would happen if someone just touched it? Hypothetically." Whitlock didn't move, didn't respond, didn't break posture. Trump grinned. For a country that's all about tradition, you people take silence to a whole new level." And as his hand drifted slightly closer toward the boundary line, the quiet tension in the room began to thicken. For a moment, it was unclear whether Donald Trump was being playful or deliberate. He stood just outside the velvet rope, the toes of his polished shoes kissing the invisible line that separated reverence from recklessness. His eyes squinted, not out of awe, but calculation, measuring distance, risk, response time. The same way one might weigh the feel of a casino chip before placing it on the table. "Funny," he said, tilting his head. "You can practically smell the money on it." Dr. Reeves tightened her grip on the edge of her clipboard. "It is priceless, sir." Trump turned back to her, clearly amused. "Right. Priceless. That's what they say when they don't want to name a number. But if you did, hypothetically, what would you say? 100 million? 2? Whitlock didn't shift. But behind his ceremonial stillness, something ancient in his chest curled slightly tighter. This wasn't curiosity. It wasn't diplomacy. It was disruption. The former president's bodyguard leaned slightly toward the conservator. Mr. Trump would like a few more moments, alone, if possible, for privacy. "That's not protocol," Dr. Reeves replied evenly, "and the room is under monitored supervision." "Understood," the aide said, but didn't move. Trump took a half-step closer. The crown, still uncased, gleamed under the chamber lights, its golden arches catching glints of soft daylight filtered through the stained glass above. A perfect symmetry of power and history, a silence older than every man in the room. And yet, Trump was already speaking over it. "Back home, we had a fake one in one of the resorts," he said. "Had a bunch of rhinestones glued on. Honestly, from this distance, hard to tell the difference." Another chuckle from his aide. The conservators remained stone-faced. Whitlock's hands did not move, but the weight of his rifle grew heavier by the second. He had been taught never to interrupt, to stand as still as the crown itself, not to protect royalty, but to protect legacy. The idea that some things should never be touched without permission, without sacrifice. Then came the worst sound of the morning. Trump's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out casually and opened the camera again. "What do you think?" he asked, raising it chest high. "One with the crown in the background. Good lighting. Maybe even one with me pointing, just for scale." He turned slightly. His hand began to drift. No glass, no security rope. Just inches of air between his index finger and the ancient velvet. Whitlock's right boot slid half an inch forward, so subtly that only the senior curator noticed. Trump didn't. "You can relax," Trump smirked. "I'm not going to steal it. I just want to feel what it's like to be that close." His finger kept moving, and Whitlock's entire body began to shift, not in panic, but in decision. Because in 5 more seconds, the crown would no longer be untouched. And history does not forgive fingerprints. It happened in the space between a breath and a blink. Donald Trump extended his arm, casual, confident, index finger, hovering just above the rim of the velvet pedestal. It wasn't fast. It wasn't frantic. It was the kind of movement made by a man who'd never been told no in a room where he believed everything was a prop, including history. The crown of St. Edward shimmered just inches away. No case, no protection. Its gold frame glowed in the filtered light like something still warm from being forged, not just priceless, but irreplaceable. And his hand kept going, a soft intake of breath from the senior conservator, the sound of a shoe scuff from behind. The bodyguard didn't move, perhaps assuming this was part of the show. Even the aide holding the phone didn't lower the camera. They were too used to spectacle. Only Whitlock moved. 1 step. Silent. Precise. His left hand left the rifle, his right hand raised. And before the fingertip could make contact, he intercepted the wrist mid-air, not violently, not with force, but with a gloved grip that stopped the motion cold. Trump froze. Everyone froze. The air turned sharp with disbelief. Whitlock's voice, when it came, was low and formal. "Sir, I must ask you to step back from the crown." No shouting, no aggression, just the clearest sentence spoken that entire morning. Trump's head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing. "Did you just touch me?" Whitlock held his gaze. The item was within contact range. Preservation protocol required intervention. For a second, the former president said nothing. Then he yanked his hand back with exaggerated offense, shaking it as if swatting away an insect. "I want his name," he said to his aide. "Get his name." This man just laid hands on a former head of state. Behind them, the conservators were still rooted in place. A yeoman warder quietly stepped to the side, thumb pressing a recessed panel by the door, a silent alert to internal security. Whitlock returned his hand to the rifle. He said nothing more, but his face, still expressionless, seemed carved from stone. Trump turned to the bodyguard. "We'll deal with this, immediately." "Sir," Digital Reeves finally spoke, voice trembling with control, "perhaps we should reconvene once His Royal Highness arrives." And almost on cue, footsteps echoed down the far hall. Trump straightened his collar. "Good. Maybe now someone with actual authority will remind your people who's the guest here." As Prince William approached, Whitlock resumed his original stance, as if nothing had occurred, as if the last 30 seconds hadn't just brought 300 years of ceremonial discipline to the edge of collapse, but the crown remained untouched. And for a soldier like Whitlock, that mattered more than anything that was about to happen next. Prince William entered through the eastern corridor with the quiet poise of someone trained to steady a room before he ever speaks. But the room wasn't steady. Donald Trump turned toward him, face flushed with the heat of public insult and private embarrassment. His voice came out sharp and performative, intended more for the aides and phones than for William himself. "Your guard," he began, gesturing toward Whitlock without even looking at him, "just physically laid hands on me. No warning, no cause. I want an explanation." The conservators exchanged glances. The yeoman warder stepped discreetly to the side, and Whitlock, precisely where he had stood from the beginning, said nothing. William's gaze moved across the scene, not hurried, but measured. He looked at Trump, then at the crown, then at Whitlock. "What happened?" he asked quietly, but not softly. Trump cut in again. "I leaned in, just to get a closer look. I didn't touch anything, and this man assaulted me. I don't know if that's how you run things here, but back home we don't put hands on presidents." Whitlock finally spoke, voice low and clear. The crown was exposed. The 5-foot barrier was breached. Contact proximity protocol activated. Intervention was non-forceful and limited. William nodded once, and gee, almost imperceptibly. Trump scoffed. So you're backing him? Really? William didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned toward Dr. Reeves. Was the crown in its case? No, sir. The casing was removed for inspection as scheduled. And the guest approached? Yes, sir, beyond the rope. Photographs? She hesitated. Yes, sir. A phone was used within close range. William exhaled through his nose. Not angry, not surprised, just aware of what had unfolded. Then he looked back at Trump. Let's step outside. This room is not for conversations. It's for legacy. Trump didn't move right away. You should think carefully about how this looks. I already have, William replied. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a show. But something in the room shifted. Trump turned abruptly, walking toward the side door, his aides stumbling to keep up. The bodyguard lingered just a second too long before following, and then it was quiet again. Whitlock remained where he stood. No one congratulated him. No one even looked at him directly. But the crown still rested, unbothered, on its cushion of purple velvet. And in a palace where ceremony was everything, that was all the proof anyone needed, for now. But outside that chamber, the story was already moving, because somewhere in the halls of power, a diplomatic complaint had just been filed. And the consequences would not stay quiet for long. The crown room was sealed within minutes, its lights dimmed, the velvet rope restored. The casing slid gently back over the crown of St. Edward by gloved conservator hands, hands that trembled more now than they had during the inspection. Outside, in the adjoining chamber reserved for royal deliberation, the former president paced like a man who hadn't expected to be told no, certainly not in a castle. Trump's voice carried despite the heavy oak doors. You don't lay hands on heads of state. That's not security. That's assault. I've been in meetings with Putin, with Xi. No one ever touched me. He spun toward his aide. You got that on video, right? The younger man nodded nervously, tapping through his phone. Across the room, Prince William stood beside a tall window overlooking the gravel courtyard. His expression was unreadable. Neither defensive nor approving. He didn't speak. He didn't interrupt. He simply let the air settle. A senior official from the Lord Chamberlain's office arrived minutes later. Thin-rimmed glasses, black folder, the kind of man whose words were chosen like chess pieces. We've reviewed initial reports, he said calmly, addressing both parties. We acknowledge a deviation from standard ceremonial protocol. However, the guard's action fell within emergency preservation guidelines pending full review. Trump laughed, loud and sharp. So your position is that I endangered the crown? No, sir, the official said smoothly. Only that proximity thresholds were exceeded. Touch risk was assessed. Intervention was minimal and non-forceful. I didn't touch anything, Trump snapped. He grabbed me. The official turned slightly. Sergeant Whitlock? Whitlock stood silently just inside the room, back straight, expression unchanged. Sir, he said. My response was proportional to the risk, as trained. Did you receive clearance from a superior officer to make contact? No, sir, there was no time. Trump shook his head, arms folded. You people talk about tradition like it's sacred, but the moment someone steps in to protect it, you get cold feet. William finally spoke. His voice was soft, but final. This room isn't about tradition. It's about restraint. No one replied. Trump exhaled. I want a formal apology and disciplinary action. Or this goes back to Washington. And your headlines won't be about golden crowns. They'll be about diplomatic violations. The Lord Chamberlain's aide nodded politely, writing something in the folder. Understood, sir. A full internal review is underway. Trump's bodyguard stepped closer. We'll be in touch. As they left the room, Trump looked once more at Whitlock, no longer angry, but measuring. The kind of look given to someone who broke the rules to preserve something larger than themselves. Then he was gone. William turned to Whitlock. You'll be contacted shortly. And with that, he too stepped away. Whitlock was alone again. still standing, still silent. But he could already feel what was coming. The hearing was held in a cold room with warm paintings. The Waterloo Chamber had once hosted monarchs and war heroes. Today, its long, polished table was laid with folders instead of medals, and its velvet-backed chairs were occupied not by generals, but by bureaucrats in muted suits. Sergeant Arthur Whitlock stood at the far end, alone. No counsel, no commanding officer, just the straight line of his spine and the invisible weight of what he'd touched and what he hadn't let be touched. Across from him sat the Lord Chamberlain, the Crown Equerry, and two members from the Royal Household Legal Directorate. Not a trial, not a court-martial, but something heavier in its own way, a formal review of conduct within ceremonial confinement. The chair leaned forward, glancing once at a typed report. You made physical contact with the guest. Confirm? Yes, sir. You issued a verbal instruction? Yes, sir. Did you receive direct authorization to intervene? No, sir. The room held stillness like a blade. Were you aware that the guest in question was a former president of the United States? Yes, sir. Were you aware that diplomatic deference in such circumstances often takes priority over protocol? Whitlock didn't flinch. I was aware that the Crown was uncased and within reach, and that my role was to ensure it remained untouched. The equerry scribbled something down. A younger legal aide spoke up. Did you observe any actual contact between the guest and the Crown? No, sir. I prevented it. Couldn't you have issued a verbal warning instead? I judged that verbal delay would not prevent contact in time. The Lord Chamberlain folded his hands. You realise the optics of this. An armed guard making physical contact with a foreign dignitary have caused concern beyond these walls. Yes, sir. Do you believe you acted appropriately? Whitlock paused. But not for long. I believe I acted to protect an object older than the office that guest held. I believe I was trained to prioritise legacy over comfort. There was no applause, no nods of approval, just the scratch of another pen. The final verdict came 20 minutes later. No dismissal, no criminal charge, but no honour either. Whitlock's action was ruled a ceremonial breach of diplomatic protocol, mitigated but undeniable. He was to be stripped of rank, removed from ceremonial rotation, reassigned indefinitely. They let him leave through the side corridor. No escort, no uniformed reprimand, just the quiet sound of his boots on polished stone and the empty space where his insignia used to sit on his chest. By the time he returned to his quarters, the formal communication had already arrived. Black envelope, gold seal. Signed by the household. Effective immediately, Sergeant Whitlock is relieved of ceremonial duties and rank designation until further notice. He placed the envelope on his desk, didn't open it again. He unlaced his boots, unbuckled his belt, removed the red tunic from its hanger and laid it flat on the bed. The epaulettes were empty now, and for the first time in 17 years he wasn't a guard. He was just a man who had once stepped forward when everyone else stood still. The red tunic no longer felt like his. It lay folded on the edge of his bed, the way it had every night for nearly 2 decades. Except now there was no ceremony waiting for it. No posting, no name on the rotation list. Just fabric and history, separated from the man who had once worn it. Whitlock sat in silence. No one had come to collect it. There would be no parade, no salute. That kind of exit was for those who died in service, or those who'd served in ways the public could understand. But this wasn't a retirement. It was a quiet erasure, the kind done behind doors with no signatures. Just polite nods and procedural phrases like reassignment under internal review. Outside his barracks window, the courtyard moved on. Guards drilled in pairs. Tour groups murmured in the distance. Somewhere across the gravel, a boy's voice shouted something joyful, oblivious. Whitlock didn't move. He reached into the top drawer of his cabinet and pulled out a small envelope, unlabelled, slightly creased from years of being folded into corners of luggage and coat pockets. Inside was a photograph, black and white, slightly faded. His grandfather in full guard's dress. A man who'd stood post at the coronation of Elizabeth II. The same uniform, the same hat, the same quiet eyes. They didn't speak of honour in his family, only duty. The kind that wasn't about medals or speeches, the kind that no one noticed, unless you failed at it. Whitlock stared at the photo, then carefully placed it back into the drawer. The discharge had not been public, but the whispers would come. He overreacted. He touched a guest. He forgot his place. He'd heard versions of it before, not aimed at him, but at others who'd stepped an inch outside the script. Guards who blinked at the wrong time, who breathed when silence was expected. But none of them had ever reached for the crown, and none had stopped someone else from doing so. He stood up. The tunic remained folded. He didn't hang it, didn't press it. He just placed it back in the garment bag, gently, as if returning a relic to its shrine. Then he closed the zip. Across the room, his boots sat beside the locker, still polished, still perfect. He didn't put them on, because for the first time in 17 years, there was nowhere to march, and no one watching the man who had once stood between a relic and a fingertip. Only silence, the same kind he had once used to protect history. Now, it simply filled the space he left behind. 3 mornings later, just past dawn, a plain white envelope slid beneath Whitlock's door. No seal, no stamp, no delivery slip, just silence. The same silence that had defined most of his life in uniform. He found it resting against the threshold, like something accidentally forgotten. But when he picked it up, he knew instantly it hadn't been misplaced. The paper was heavy, crest embossed, private household stationery. He opened it without sitting down. Inside was a single sheet, not typed, handwritten. You were not wrong. That was it. No header, no explanation, no ceremonial apology, just a signature that didn't need to be deciphered. He stood holding it for a long time, until a knock sounded, 2 soft raps on the lower panel of the door. When he opened it, a courier in plain dress stood there with a slim black folder. "From the Prince's office," the man said simply. "You're to read it in private." Then he turned and walked away. Whitlock opened the folder on his desk. At the top of the document, Internal Personnel Transfer, Royal Household Assignment. Below that, Reinstatement, effective immediately. Designation, Royal Household Security Liaison, Office of the Prince of Wales. Classification, non-ceremonial private assignment role. Discreet preservation of institutional memory and ceremonial integrity. He blinked. Not return to the guard. Not a reversal of the tribunal's ruling. Something different. Something deeper. He turned the page. Attached was a signed letter, this time longer, from William himself. Mr. Whitlock, history rarely applauds the first to act, especially when silence is expected. But legacy does not survive because it is loved. It survives because someone chooses not to look away. The uniform may no longer rest on your shoulders, but the weight of trust remains. Heavier, perhaps. Quieter, but essential. We do not forget who guards us, even when they stand alone. Welcome to where the real protection begins. No ceremony, no salute, just purpose, repurposed. Whitlock closed the folder. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. He simply reached for the same polished boots sitting beside his locker, laced them tight, adjusted the crease of his shirt, and stepped outside without the red. Because some uniforms are worn in plain sight, and some are worn so the crown never knows it was almost touched. Should a royal guard lose his rank for defending the crown, even if the guest was a former president? And if you were in Sergeant Whitlock's boots, would you have stepped forward? Drop your answers in the comments. We read every one. If you believe tradition should never bow to power, hit that like button. Make sure you're subscribed with the bell icon turned on, so you never miss the next story they tried to bury. And if someone you know still thinks royal guards are just there to look pretty, share this video with them. Your next stories are already appearing on screen. Watch those next, and we'll see you tomorrow, same time, same place, with another story you won't believe is true. Until then, stay sharp.